So for the spinal cord, obviously this is going to be in the back, right? A lot of people will say backbone. We're not talking about the bones. We're not talking about the vertebra. We're going to be talking about the actual cord, which is the neural tissue. So the spinal cord is housed within the backbone or the vertebral column or the vertebral cavity, whatever verbiage you want to use. It is going to be surrounded by those meninges that we saw in the brain. So just as we will pad the brain, we will also pad the spinal cord. We will have the same pia, arachnoid, and dura mater, and the exact same setup around the spinal cord since it is delicate neural tissue. Obviously, the spinal cord is going to carry sensory and motor information between the brain and to the other parts of the body, and it will give rise to the spinal nerves. So you will see that today as we go through some things. This picture is in here because this is one that I used to use in practice just to show people how incredibly important the spinal cord and the spinal nerves are. So as a chiropractor, a lot of times people think that it's just for pain in the back, and that's why you go see a chiropractor, is to help you with your pain, but that's not exactly accurate. Although we can help with pain, it is really about so much more than that, and I didn't go into the field because of pain management. I went into the field actually because I found out that I could help kids who had neurological issues without drugs and without surgery, so helping them on a more natural level. And the way that we do that is by addressing what's going on inside of the spinal cord, or excuse me, inside of the spinal column, to have influence on the spinal nerves coming from the spinal cord. So if you look here, you can see that there are different areas of the spine. So you have the cervical, the thoracic, the lumbar, and the sacral spinal sections, and each one of those is going to be related to different parts of the body. So whether I have a kid who constantly has ear infections, runny nose, whether they're constantly congested, or whether you have a kid who's having issues with colic, issues with not eating well, so you can see liver, diaphragm, stomach, pancreas, spleen, kidneys. If that child is not doing very well with the nutrition in their life, then that may show up as problems in these particular areas. Or even if mom is giving good nutrition, if there are any issues within the spine and these bones here are turned in any awkward positions, it can put pressure on the nerves that are coming out of the spinal cord, and then it will cause issues in these organs. So what we want is a spine that's in great alignment. That's why we palpate, that's why we feel the spine, in order to ensure that all of the bones are in place where they're supposed to be. Any bones that are not in place, we would call that a subluxation. So I know that's a long word, but subluxation basically means a misalignment of the bone, putting impingement on a spinal nerve, which is then going to negatively impact different parts of the body. And it all depends upon where that nerve is ultimately running. So that's why you can see some of the things over here. If you have impingement in different places, you could get anything from headaches to coughs to croup to even stomach troubles, indigestion. Like I told you guys in the very beginning of this, one of my favorite things to do in practice is to help women be able to carry to term successfully, especially after bouts of infertility or miscarriage. So there are things that I will do down in this area here in the lumbar and the sacral area, because this is where you're going to have innervation to your reproductive organs. So by combining a healthy aligned spine with good nutrition, we can make changes to all of these things going on over here. That's also why I get adjusted every single week, so do my kids, because it's good and important to maintain for the purposes of where those spinal nerves are ultimately going. You guys know that whenever we look at heart disease, that's the #1 killer. And whenever they have done autopsies on people who all of a sudden die in a sudden cardiac death, what they are seeing is that there is impingement in the area of the thoracic spine that then goes on to innervate in the heart section. So very important to make sure that we do keep good proper alignment every single day so these spinal nerves can work like they're supposed to. So as we go through and we talk about this is what the cord looks like and this is how the information runs through the cord, you may feel like a little bit overwhelmed because there's so much information that's going to be moving through these different sections of the cord, but just kind of keep this particular picture in mind to say, this is why this is important that I learn this and why I need to know this, so that way I can understand how this spine is going to communicate with the rest of the body. Okay? So when we're looking at the actual cord itself, the actual neural tissue, it's about 18 inches long and a ½ inch wide from the brain to L1 or L2. So that's very important. So I want you to make sure and circle that. L1, L2 is going to be the first and second lumbar vertebra in your low back. Your spinal cord does not go all the way down to your tailbone being your coccyx. Instead, it stops at L1, L2 because around age 4 or 5 years old, your spinal cord is going to stop lengthening, but your vertebral column, because they are bones, are going to continue to grow as you continue to grow taller. So we do have a particular term that you want to make sure you know. That means the end of the spinal cord. That's coming up here in just a second. We have 4 regions, as I already just showed you on that picture: cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral. And there is bilateral symmetry to the spinal cord. So today, whenever we do some drawing, I may only draw structures on one side, but just know that it is going to be on both sides. Both sides are going to look the exact same. There is that bilateral symmetry. We do have 31 segments that will give rise to our spinal nerves. So whenever we're looking at the bones, the count for bones is not always consistent with the count for nerves, and I will show you guys why as we go through this particular PowerPoint. Enlargements of the spinal cord are going to be areas where you can see a visibly large particular portion of the cord. We have them in the cervical area and in the lumbosacral area. And this is because we're going to have a lot of information here that in the cervical area will go on to supply the upper limb. The lumbosacral will go on to supply the lower limb. So we can see those two enlargements visibly. Here you can see the cervical enlargement in the area around C1 or C7, and then you can see the lumbosacral enlargement around T12, L1. So this thing that I have boxed here, the conus medullaris, this is the end of the spinal cord. Okay, that is the term for the end of the spinal cord, conus medullaris between L1 and L2. So since this is the end of the spinal cord, then the question can then become, well, what is all of this other stuff that comes inferiorly to the conus medullaris? And that's a great question. So the Cauda Equina is the other thing that I have kind of highlighted here for you. The Cauda Equina is a bundle of nerve fibers that leave the inferior tip of the conus medullaris to go on to continue to supply those lower limbs. The Cauda Equina is so named because it looks like a horse's tail. So equina meaning horse. So it just looks like a bushy horse's tail because it's a bundle of nerve fibers down the back. And then I've also put a box around this area here, Phylum Terminale. The Phylum Terminale is going to be the very terminal end point, and this is actually an extension of pia mater. So pia mater, remember, was that meningeal layer that can protect the spinal cord. This Phylum Terminale is going to anchor down near the coccyx in order to prevent any movement, any unnecessary movement of the spinal cord. So it keeps it from bouncing up and down inside of this vertebral cavity. It is an anchoring structure, which is incredibly important for stability and stabilization. So as you look at this key up here, what you can see, you have again those 4 regions: cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral. They are all color coded. And then you don't see up here in this key the coccygeal. So down here, the tailbone is called the coccyx, and we do have a coccygeal nerve down here as well. Whenever we are looking at the bones, make a little note to yourself that in the vertebra for the cervical spine, there are 7 bones. Okay, 7. 7 vertebra, but 8 cervical nerves. So sometimes I get students a little bit confused because those numbers are not the same. And the reason why those numbers are not the same is because the first cervical nerve that you see up here, C1, it actually will leave the spinal cord above the first cervical vertebra. So that gives us an extra cervical nerve. That's why you see the C8 right here. So you have 8 cervical nerves, even though you only have 7 cervical vertebrae. For the thoracic spine, you will have 12 bones and 12 nerves. So that stays consistent in the thoracic spine. In the lumbar spine, you will have 5 bones and 5 nerves. So there is consistency there as well. And then in the sacral area, let's talk about this for a second. As a child, when you are born, you're born with 275 bones, okay? As an adult, you have 206. So why the difference? Because as a child who needs to leave the womb, all of the bones are not fused together so that you have more flexibility and the ability to get out of the vaginal canal. So the baby, when it is born, is going to have different pieces to their sacrum. However, as an adult, we consider the sacrum just one bone. So when the baby is born, there's going to be 5 pieces to the sacrum, but as an adult, it's counted as 1. So we technically have 1 sacral bone, but we have 5 sacral nerves. And the coccygeal, it's going to be 4 different pieces as a baby. As an adult, it's all fused together as 1, but we only have 1 nerve. Okay, you can see that it is CO1. That's because it is coccyx. Cervical is just a C. So don't get those two confused. Cervical is just a C, coccyx is CO. 1 nerve. Okay, my student a couple of semesters ago made the best way to remember this in regards to the number of bones. As you're trying to learn how to count the bones, which is one thing that you'll have to do in lab, because there is a difference in the number of nerves versus bones, what she decided to do was just focusing on the counting of the bones. She said, okay, if we have 7 cervical bones and 12 thoracic bones and 5 lumbar bones that have to be counted out, she said since cervical starts with a C, she wanted that to represent coffee. Since thoracic starts with a T, she wanted that to represent tea, like TEA. And then since lumbar starts with an L, she wanted to represent liquor. So she said you have coffee at 7, tea at 12, and liquor at 5. And I just thought that was just the cutest and best thing ever to remember. How do you count the cervical, the thoracic, and the lumbar bones correctly? Now the sacrum and the coccyx, it's easy to do that on the skeletons in the lab because they're all fused as 1, right? But your coffee at 7, tea at 12, liquor at 5 will help you with remembering how many bones do I have in those different sections. And just remember, if you're counting nerves, you have that 1 extra cervical nerve that you do not have in the other places in the thoracic and the lumbar.
And you said there's 5 and 5 in lumbar and sacral?
So 5 bones, 5 nerves in lumbar. In sacrum, as an adult, 1 bone, 5 nerves. Okay, 1 bone, 5 nerves. As a kid, 5 bones, 5 nerves.
What age do those change into 1, I guess?
That's a good question. I forgot what age everything starts to kind of fuse all together completely. And I think it's actually, I could be lying, but I think it's actually sooner in girls than it is in boys. But I would have to look that up. That's a good question.
And then coccyx is just 1?
Yes, coccyx is 1 bone in adult, 1 nerve. Yep, you got it. Okay. All right, so that is our spinal cord extending from the brain all the way down. Remember, this is the area where the actual cord ends, L1, L2. Other structures beyond that would be nerve roots, and the final extension of pia in order to do what? Why do we have this final extension of pia?
Anchor.
Anchor, perfect. We've got to have that stability. We do not need this jumping up and down. If you do jumping jacks, then this spinal cord should not be doing jumping jacks with you, okay? It needs to be still. So that phylum terminale will help it be still. Okay, so for those of you who like words, this is your word slide, everything that we just kind of went through in that particular picture. If we're naming the spinal nerves, this is kind of some of the stuff that I just told you about as to why we have 8 cervical nerves, even though we only have 7 cervical vertebrae, okay? And it's because that first nerve runs above the first cervical vertebra. All of the others will be named for the vertebra above it. So as we are looking at this lateral view, you can see here these nerves that are coming out of the spinal cord going in between these bones. So they come out of a little hole that's called the intervertebral foramen. And as they run through the intervertebral foramen, ultimately they are going to be going on to innervate different parts of your body. So whenever you see this cord, what you can see is we have blue, we have orange. Look how the green and the green and the purple is not lining up. Remember, that's because your spinal cord does not continue to lengthen, so you will have all of these nerve fibers. This is where your Cauda Equina comes from. They are coming from the actual cord, but it's not running the same length of the bones. Because of this, this is also what will allow people to get an epidural safer, not that they're always safe, but safer, because whenever you get an epidural, they're going to go in the lower lumbar spine so that there is not an issue with potentially getting into the actual spinal cord itself. So you can see here that whenever they inject, so this would be your back, whenever they inject, they will go into an area where your cord is not, because they will drop down further than that L2 area in order to give you an epidural. Okay? So whenever we're looking at the roots and the ganglia, we have 2 branches that are going to form those spinal nerves that you just saw, those nerves that have to come out of the cord to go on to innervate everything inside of the body. So this is the part where we're going to start doing some drawing, because a lot of these words may seem to be like, I don't really know what's happening, if you're not familiar with the actual anatomical structures of the spinal cord. So let's do some drawing. Get out your pencils or pens or whatever you want to do so that we can make a spinal cord and we can see what these different things are going to actually look like. We're going to first start with not a complete circle, but whenever you make your drawing, what I want you to do is I want you to make sure that you do something like this. And I apologize that this is not going to be the greatest drawing. It's hard for me to control this pen. So it's kind of like a sideways Pac-Man. Or to some people, maybe like a hemorrhoid pillow. Okay, but you need this piece right here, this piece in the middle that doesn't complete the full circle. That's going to be important here in just a second. So first thing that we're going to do after we have our circle here is I want you to particularly label that open section right there, so that way we can orient ourselves for anterior and posterior. That's one of the most important things to do whenever you are assessing spinal cord structures, is to first orient yourself. What is anterior? What is posterior? So what we're going to do is we're going to name this the anterior median, because it's in the middle. What is the word for a really deep groove? That's shallow. What's the other word?
Fissure.
Fissure, perfect. Anterior median fissure. So we have this really deep groove in the anterior portion of the cord. And then on the posterior portion of the cord, let's go back to my just regular drawing. Well, I guess I can't. Just put a line, okay? On that one line, we are going to label that the posterior. We're still in the middle, so it's median. And what was the shallow groove called? Sulcus, perfect. So we have a posterior median sulcus and an anterior median fissure. That is one way that you can kind of orient yourself whenever you start looking at the spinal cord to figure out where is the deeper groove. The deeper groove is always going to be anterior. Now, we've got to draw a butterfly shape. Let's see if I have the ability to do it with this very hard to control pen. So first thing that we're going to do is this, okay? And then we're going to do this.
So the area where the line is, that's the posterior?
Yep. The area where this line right here, this is the posterior median sulcus. Put a little arrow there for you. Okay. All right, so this is the best butterfly that I could do. But what I want to point out to you is you need to make sure that on your butterfly that you have the portion that is on the posterior aspect of the cord going all the way to the back of the cord. That's very important. Whereas on the anterior portion, you can see that it does not come all the way to the anterior aspect of the cord. It doesn't actually touch up in the front. It only touches in the back. So that's another way for you to orient yourself, for you to figure out what is anterior versus what is posterior. So what I always say is the back goes all the way to the back. The back of the butterfly actually touches the back of the cord. So the back goes to the back. That's another way to figure out what is A versus P, anterior versus posterior. Okay. Then we want to put a little circle right in the center of the butterfly. That little circle right in the center of the butterfly, you want to label that the central canal. Central canal. And anybody remember what flows within the central canal? Cerebrospinal fluid. Very good. So within you can label this central canal and then put a little note to yourself, this is where you will have cerebrospinal fluid. Okay. Now, on the butterfly, make a note to yourself that anything that is inside of the butterfly is going to be gray matter. Okay, the butterfly is gray. Anything outside of the butterfly is white. So the gray and the white is very easy to differentiate in the spinal cord because it's either inside of the butterfly or it's not. Whereas in the brain, you know, you have these clusters of gray embedded in white matter, and that doesn't happen here within the spinal cord. So it's much easier to tell the difference in gray versus white. Now, for your gray, you need to make a note that anything that's gray is going to be called a horn. So you're going to see this word over and over and over again. We will call the posterior aspect of the butterfly the dorsal horn. The anterior aspect of the butterfly is going to be the anterior horn. So horn just means we're referencing the gray, okay? So gray is horns, white are columns. If it's white, we're going to call it a column. And an AKA that you will frequently see for column is funiculus. Funiculus. So that's a fun word, right? F-U-N-I-C-U-L-U-S. Funiculus. So we have gray horns, we have white columns or white funiculi. Whenever we are looking at the spinal cord, the gray that let me just go ahead and draw it in here. The gray that you can see from side to side that's around this central canal is going to be called a gray commissure. Remember, commissure means bridge. So in this area right here, we will have the gray commissure, kind of where I put in between the two arrows. So think about it as a bridge so that information can travel across from side to side. Okay, that's your gray commissure. So if this is the dorsal horn or posterior horn, what would that make this white column right here? What do you think we would call that? The dorsal or the posterior white column, exactly. So this is dorsal column. This is going to be anterior column. Let me see if I can kind of draw. Let's not do a circle. Just do a label. This would be the anterior column, both sides. This is posterior. So what would that make this right here? Lateral, perfect. Okay. So you've got these three different columns, posterior, anterior, and lateral. On your spinal cord, you have a dorsal horn and you have an anterior horn. When we're talking about gray, what you don't see is a lateral horn. And that's because I haven't drawn it, because I specifically wanted to tell you guys that whenever you are looking at the spinal cord, there is not a lateral horn in every section. So use a different color. Let me see if it'll let me use a different color here to signify. No, I guess I can't. Let's see if I can change it. I guess not. Okay, if you can use a different color, use a different color to signify that you will have a lateral horn, and then just make a note to yourself that the lateral horn is only going to be within the thoracic and lumbar sections. You do not see this lateral horn in the cervical or sacral sections.
And it's just there on that one side?
What's that?
Is it only on the one side?
It's on both sides.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So sorry, if I'm only drawing it on one side, just always remember it. Everything will have bilateral symmetry, all of it. Good question though. So lateral horn equals thoracic and lumbar only. Okay. Now, this is our cord, but we were just talking about our nerves. So our nerves have to come out of this cord. So what we're going to do is we're going to draw something like this. I wish my thing actually, let's see if I can get a different undo. Something like this. Whenever you're here, I want you to make a really big bubble on this side right here. That bubble is going to be important. Okay? This thing that we just drew here, this is going to be called our dorsal root. And the bubble I'm going to abbreviate DRG, but the bubble is the dorsal root ganglion. So remember whenever we were talking about the different types of neurons and we talked about unipolar, bipolar, multipolar, remember how they all looked a little bit different? We drew the multipolar, but remember the unipolar, how it had the cell body off to the side? So because that is for sensory neurons, and this is a place for sensory neurons to go, that's why you have this dorsal root ganglion, because the axon will be running through the root, and then the cell bodies will be up here in the dorsal root ganglion. So it gives it this little bubble that you will only see in the dorsal root. You will not see that in the anterior root that we're going to draw in just a second. So this is another way for you to orient yourself, anterior versus posterior. If you see the bubble inside of the root, then you know that you're going to be looking at the back of that spinal cord. Okay, so let's go ahead and then draw our anterior root. So it's going to come this way. Let's label it anterior root. And what you need to put on your dorsal root as a note for yourself is that this is sensory only. Okay, the only information that's going to be running through that dorsal root is sensory, aka what would we call sensory as an AKA? Starts with an A.
Afferent.
Afferent, very good. So this is going to be our afferent pathway for our afferent neuron, sensory neuron. That means that anterior, this is going to be efferent only, or motor only. So make a little note to yourself. This is the reason why it's so incredibly important that you orient yourself anterior versus posterior, because if you don't, then you may mix up what information is running where. So whenever you're looking at your different ways, whether it's the dorsal root ganglion, whether it's the posterior median sulcus, whether it's the dorsal horn that goes all the way to the back of the cord, just remember anything that you're looking at dorsally is going to be for sensory related information. Anything that's going to be anterior is going to be motor related information. Okay? So what happens is if we get a sensation, let's say from our finger, let's say you poked your finger with a knife as you were cutting. The sensory information is going to come from your finger and run into the dorsal root, into the spinal cord. When we're in the spinal cord, then it's going to integrate and say, okay, what do we need to do with this information that was just received coming from the right index finger, okay? Then it will say, all right, this is what we need to do. We need to get that person to move the finger away from the knife and then go clean the finger off. So information for motor activity will be transmitted through the anterior root. So sensory information will come in, motor information will go out. And that's how it will kind of occur in that particular way. Now, whenever we have the dorsal root and the anterior root meet up together, I wish I had more space on this particular drawing, but I'll use a different color. They're going to come together, okay? As they come together, this is ultimately going to become your spinal nerve. I'm going to put S in. Once they meet together, we will then say that is your spinal nerve. That is what we just saw on the picture coming out of your cord. It is a combination of a dorsal root and an anterior root, which means that all spinal nerves are going to be called mixed nerves because they'll be able to carry both sensory information and motor information. Okay, so all spinal nerves are going to be referenced as mixed nerves. So from the spinal nerve, it's then going to split again. Okay, I'm gonna do a little drawing over here. I'm gonna see if I can make it like a little bit smaller as I try to do a new representation. So get my bubble. Dorsal root, anterior root. They come together. Once they come together, what does this give us? Spinal nerve, right? So here's my actual spinal nerve. New color. Hope you have more space on your paper than I do on mine. New color is because they're going to bifurcate. That means they're going to split off. So even though they come together right here as the spinal nerve, they're ultimately going to separate. And whenever they separate, this pink piece that's going to the back, we are going to call that the dorsal ramus. It's not a root, it's a ramus. That means that our anterior piece is the anterior ramus. What's an AKA for anterior?
Ventral.
Ventral, very good. So sometimes you may see it referenced as ventral ramus. Okay? Whenever we are looking at this word ramus versus the word root, this is how I want you to remember this, so that you never get this wrong on any test. The dorsal root, we said, is all what kind of information? Sensory, right? The dorsal root is all sensory information. The anterior root is all what? Motor. Come together as the spinal nerve, and it then becomes what? Mixed, right? Whenever the two split, it stays mixed. So think about it like this. The dorsal, think about this is a single guy. The anterior, this is single girl. The two come together as one in holy matrimony, okay? Two become one. So now they are intertwined together. Me and my husband are married, and even though he has his job that he goes to and I have my job that I go to, I still carry a piece of him with me always. So he's like embedded into my being. So even though I would technically be this anterior ramus, I'm no longer a single lady, I'm now a married lady. So I'm no longer just motor information, now I'm both. So even though they go off and they split, I don't want you to confuse the fact that they used to just be sensory or used to just be motor. After they become the spinal nerve, they stay mixed. That is just the way that it is, okay? So if you see the word ramus, think about the marriage. Ramus means that it is mixed in that marriage. Root means that's a single person, okay? So whenever we see what the dorsal ramus does, you know how as husbands, we generally want them to be strong and protective and kind of, you know, like be the backbone and carry us. The dorsal ramus is going to go on to innervate the skin and the muscles of the back. So that's why I'm putting it as the husband, okay? This will go on to innervate the skin and the muscles of the back. The ventral or the anterior ramus, this is going to go on and form our plexuses. So write that word to yourself. The anterior ramus makes plexuses. Now we know that a plexus is like a network. It's a whole lot of information that's going to be going on inside of a plexus. And next time we're going to go through the plexuses and you will see all of the different nerves in the cervical plexus and the brachial plexus and the lumbar plexus and the sacral plexus. So I want you to remember back to this particular analogy. The anterior ramus is going to make these plexuses. So there's a whole lot of stuff that the anterior ramus is going to be responsible for. It's kind of like, you know, in real life. The guys, you know, they usually are singularly focused. They're like, I'm just going to do this one thing, right? And us girls, we're like, I'm going to do it all. I'm going to do everything. I got all of this. Anterior ramus is going to be responsible for a lot. So I'm not saying that's the right thing for us to do, but that's generally what we do. So now that we see this is our spinal cord, we've got two roots that will give us a nerve. The nerve will then bifurcate into a dorsal ramus and an anterior ramus. We're going to have lots of different information that will be flowing through these different structures. Now, hopefully, some of this stuff will make a little bit more sense to you as we continue on through our particular PowerPoint. So let's go back to our PowerPoint. Oops. All right, so we have the anterior root. You guys saw that. You drew it. Remember, this is going to be associated with motor because it's a root. Posterior, sensory, because it's a root. The spinal ganglia that we drew, also called the dorsal root ganglia, this will contain those cell bodies of the sensory neurons that form the posterior root. So again, those unipolar neurons. Whenever we are whenever we are looking at the picture that we drew, again, just to remind yourself, white matter, very easy to see. Gray matter, always going to be the butterfly. Posterior root, dorsal root ganglion, good ways to identify whether or not we are in the anterior or posterior section of the spinal cord. These are the other ways that you can also identify the anterior versus the posterior as well. So since I didn't have a great ability to draw the two roots coming together to create your spinal nerve, there you can actually see those two coming together to create that nerve. So again, the nerves formed by the union of the posterior and anterior root, one from each side at each vertebral level. So we do have that bilateral symmetry, one from each side. So you'll have one coming from the right side and one coming from the left side at C1, C2, C3, all the way on down. Whenever we're looking at those spinal nerves, each is going to have what we call a white rami communicans and a gray. We're going to talk about this later on whenever we get into our actual pathways of things. So right now I just want you guys to kind of learn the spinal cord itself. Remember, we call it all mixed. All the spinal nerves are mixed because they contain both the afferent and the efferent motor fibers, and then they will go on to divide into the posterior and anterior ramus. Which of those is going to create plexuses?
Anterior.
Very good, anterior. Okay, so here you can see the spinal nerve quickly dividing into that dorsal ramus and that ventral ramus. At that bifurcation right there to go on ventral ramus to create the plexuses, dorsal ramus to innervate the skin and the muscles of the back, as we want our strong husband to do. So this is representing for you kind of what we talked about a little bit in regards to sensory information is going to come in, motor information is going to go out. So let's walk through this. You can see here it says the spinal nerve will collect sensory information from the peripheral structures, remember, from periphery, so like out towards our fingertip in our example. As we get the information from the periphery, it's going to come into the dorsal root. Here's your dorsal root ganglion for your unipolar cell bodies. And it's going to then drop into the dorsal horn. So what is the difference then in this red versus this purple? Add this to your picture. I can't go back to my picture, but I want you to add this to your picture. Separate your dorsal horn into two sections. Okay, so just kind of like put a line through the middle of the dorsal horn. And on the most posterior section, I want you to write in there SS. That stands for somatic sensory. SS, somatic sensory. Okay, and then on the other section, I want you to write in VS, which stands for visceral sensory. VS, visceral sensory. What did we say somatic meant?
Skeletal.
Skeleton, right? And then visceral, what does that mean?
Organs.
Organs. So what that means is if we have information that's going to be coming from, like, let's say the skin or the skeletal muscles, it's going to drop into this particular portion of the gray horn where you will have the somatic sensory nuclei. If, however, that information is coming from an organ, so you can see here from the interoceptors of the body wall, from inside, then it's going to drop within the visceral sensory section. So it's very specific. Your body is going to know, did I just cut my right finger, or is there something going on the inside with my heart? Okay, the information is going to be sent to specific sections. It's not just willy-nilly. So that's your sensory information that's going to come in, and depending upon if it's somatic sensory or if it's visceral sensory will depend upon which part of that dorsal horn it's actually going to be integrated in. Okay, now once we do the integration, then of course we now have to make some changes for that body in regards to maintaining homeostasis. So what you can see right here is on your anterior section, because now we're anterior since we're motor, on the anterior section we're also going to have visceral motor and somatic motor. So you need to write in the VM and the SM. Now what I want you to do is put the VM in that lateral horn that we drew in separately. So the VM needs to go in the lateral horn, and then the SM needs to go into the anterior horn. Okay, so VM is in the lateral horn, SM is in the anterior horn. If we're gonna be looking at integrating some visceral motor, so something needs to move inside of an organ, then that's going to come from the lateral horn, but it's still going to run through the anterior root. So that's a little bit confusing. Even though it's in the lateral gray horn, it will still leave and take the pathway through the anterior root, because that is the way that the motor is going to be able to leave spinal cord and go on to the different parts of the body. So you can see it will still run in that anterior root that you drew. And somatic motor, of course, since that's in the anterior horn, of course, that's going to take the anterior root out. Okay? And these other things, the rami, communicons, like I said, we're going to talk about all of those later on, especially whenever we get into the autonomic nervous system. So I just wanted you to see right now how we can be so specific in regards to where would the visceral motor information be, where would the somatic sensory information be, how this is all divided up inside of the actual cord itself. So those masses of gray matter, that butterfly, called nuclei, are organized into horns. We already wrote that on our paper. Posterior horns, you should now have the somatic sensory, the SS, and the visceral sensory, the VS, in your posterior horn. In the anterior horn, you should have the SM, the somatic motor, and in the lateral horn, you should have the VM for the visceral motor. Just remember, the lateral horn is thoracic and lumbar segments only. And we drew our gray commissure on our picture as well. Remember, these are the bands of gray matter around that central canal so that we can have information crossing over from left to right. Okay, so all in all, hopefully your picture looks something like this. You have a posterior median sulcus, you have an anterior median fissure. You can see where the anterior white columns are versus the lateral white versus the posterior white. What's the AKA for column? Good, funiculus, very good. You have a posterior root, you have a dorsal root ganglion, you have an anterior root. What information is running through the anterior root? Is it sensory or motor? Motor, efferent. What is the reason for the bubble for the dorsal root ganglion? What's that neuron called? With the cell body off to the side.
Unipolar.
Unipolar, very good. That sensory unipolar neuron is what's going to, that cell body is going to sit right here and create that ganglion. Okay, somatic means that it's coming from where? Good. And then visceral from where? Organs, good. The visceral motor, this is in which horn? Lateral, very good. Lateral horn is only in what two sections of the spinal cord? Thoracic and lumbar, very good. Okay. What's in the central canal? Cerebrospinal fluid, very good. And that big, huge depression, or excuse me, that groove, remember, fissure, anterior median fissure. If it's shallow, posterior median sulcus. Okay, any questions before we move forward? Guys, okay?
Is that that's obviously the transverse, right, section?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes, perfect.
now I see that up there.
Okay, and remember all of this is bilateral. So even though they don't have the SS and the VS over here on this side, remember it's over here as well. Everything is bilateral. So sensory information comes in which root?
Dorsal.
Dorsal, perfect. Motor information goes out, which root? Anterior. Dorsal root plus anterior root equals what? Spinal nerve is always what? Mixed. Spinal nerve bifurcates to go into a dorsal ramus, which is going to go on to innervate what? The back. Good. Skin and muscles of the back. And then the ventral ramus goes on to innervate the plexuses. This is going to do a ton of stuff. Okay. Remember, both the ramuses, they are married, therefore they are mixed. Okay. So again, we've already gone through all of these different columns. You guys have seen that. If you have to look at the histology section in the lab underneath the microscope, then you can see here, this is what it's going to look like underneath the microscope. Just take that picture that you drew and kind of correlate some of those things that you see on the histology section. Make your life a little bit easier by having that picture. Okay, one last thing, pia mater, you can see that it's directly attached to the cord. So we didn't draw it on our picture, but what I would do if I were you is I would go and create like a thickened area all the way around that circle. So go all the way into the anterior median fissure, all the way around the back, the whole thing, and just really thicken that line up. And then label that as your pia mater. Because remember that pia mater is going to be directly attached to the cord. So the pia mater being directly attached means that what's our next layer for our meninge on the cord? Right, it's going to be the arachnoid. So in between the pia mater and that arachnoid layer, you leave a little bit of space, because you remember you have to have that subarachnoid space between the pia and the arachnoid. What flows in the subarachnoid space? CSF, right? Okay, and then lastly you have the Dura Mater, which is going to be closest to the bone. So same thing that you see in the brain, pia, arachnoid, dura, but here in the spinal cord you're not going to see any dural folds that are going to come in, that are going to create any of these sinuses. That does not happen in the cord. It's just very simply pia, subarachnoid space, arachnoid, dura, and then we have the epidural space. So the epidural space is the space where you would actually get like the epidural if you are going to have that during labor and delivery, okay? All right. When we're talking about our white matter, again, our columns, if we use the word tract, what we're saying is this is a bundle of axons within the central nervous system. They relay the same type of information in the same direction. So ascending tracts, this is sensory information up to the brain. If we're going to ascend, obviously we're going to go up. So since the spinal cord is inferior to the brain, that is the path that we have to take in order to get up to the brain. The ascending path is going to be sensory information that goes up, because in our example, cutting the finger, when you cut your finger, that information is going to go up into the brain, and it's going to let you know it was your right index finger, not your left pinky finger. So that sensory information is going to be so specific in that particular part of the brain. We're going to get into that later on, but that would be through your ascending tract. The descending tract, of course, is going to be the motor commands. So now that the brain knows what's happening, we've got to send the motor commands down towards the spinal cord, away from the brain. So if we say ascending or descending, you know that we're either talking about sensory information going up or motor information coming down. All right, and we already went through all of the spinal meninges. Hope that you added that to your picture. Remember, meninges are there to help protect, whether it's the spinal cord or the brain. They will help carry the blood supply, because that pia that is on the brain or that is on the spinal cord will be consistent in keeping the blood vessels very close to those particular organs. They are continuous with the cranial meninges. So if we say meningitis, now you know that we have these meninges around the brain, around the spinal cord. Itis always means inflammation of something. So meningitis is inflammation of those meningeal layers. Could be viral or bacterial, could be very dangerous. Can't get over it. Question?
Just really quick, just to be sure, we need to add a space between pia and arachnoid, right?
Yes, yes. That space between pia and arachnoid, that subarachnoid space. Okay. All right, and here's just another view for you to look at it. We do have a model like this in lab as well, so expect to see this particular model where you can actually identify the different parts that we drew, as well as your meningeal layers. Whenever you're looking at a model that has the bone on it, that is another way for you to determine anterior from posterior, because what you can see on this particular model here is that this is the back of the vertebra. It's called the spinous process. If you touch your back, so everybody touch your back. Right on the center of your back, if you touch your back, then what you're feeling is the spinous process. That is this little portion of bone that is poking out right here. So if you see this on a model, then that is another way for you to identify, okay, I know anterior versus posterior now. Okay. All right, and this is just a different view, but let me quickly tell you why I highlighted this in red. This is very hard to see on the model in lab, so you really have to look for it. And it is going to be on the spinal cord model that has the bone around it. But this denticulate ligament, make a little note to yourself, is there to help provide stabilization in a medial lateral direction. Okay, stabilization in a medial to lateral direction. Just as I said, in jumping jacks, we don't want the cord going up and down. That phylum terminale will help stabilize it in a superior-inferior direction, but these denticulate ligaments that are bilateral will help stabilize it in medial-lateral. So it's held very tightly in place so that it does not bang up against that bone. Okay. Let's see, I think that we've kind of covered all of this. We talked about the dura, epidural space, subdural space, same thing as what I said in the brain, it's just a potential space. Arachnoid matter, remember the importance of the subarachnoid space because this is filled with the CSF. This is where you would actually get a lumbar puncture or a spinal tap. if you have to have that procedure because they need to withdraw CSF in order to evaluate it and determine the different ion concentrations within the CSF, the pH, et cetera, et cetera. So it would have to actually go into the subarachnoid space. Not going to be the same thing as the epidural, because that would be in a different space. And then Pia Mater, as I already said, that is going to be your extension to your Phylum Terminale, as well as your denticulate ligaments that help kind of hold that spinal cord in place so that it does not move it. Okay, and remember the blood vessels are on the surface of the Pia Mater within the brain and the spinal cord. There's a lovely little picture of an amazing dissection. Whoever did that is really good. It's very hard to do that, but that looks really good, and you can really see some of those structures coming from that spinal cord. You can see that very translucent Pia Mater. You can see that blood vessel that's being held in place by that Pia Mater. You can see that anterior median fissure. So, really cool picture. Go ahead.
With the spinal cord, it'll be different lengths in different people?
It'll be different lengths in different people.
Yeah, like is it all